In this life, there are many reasons why a person might be considered great. It may be successful, hardworking, or strong in the face of adversity. But there is one woman who I know whose life story is such a testament for what true greatness is that she entirely redefined what that word great meant to me. That woman is none other than Sylvia Messinese, my grandmother. And of all the qualities that people often attribute with those who might be considered great people, there's just a few things I would like to touch on today on why I consider my grandmother so great. Firstly, my grandmother is a woman of unrivaled patience. To share a testament of this, when my dad was born, he got terribly sick. It got to the point where he had a fever of 105 degrees, and the doctor told my grandma that her baby probably wouldn't make it past the first grade because of the damage caused to his brain by the fever. Well, that apparently wasn't good enough for her because in telling me this story, she said that she looked the doctor right in the face, smiled, and said to him, "We'll just see about that." And over the next 13 years or so, my dad did struggle in school, but every single day my grandmother would work with him and reteach every lesson from school in a way to where she could finally see in his eyes a light bulb go off and know that he understood it. And decades later, my dad is one of the smartest people and most successful people that I know, and it's all thanks to the time my grandmother took to make sure that he had every opportunity that each of us have. Not only is she patient, but the wisdom that my grandmother shares with the world around her is one of the reasons I love talking to her as much as I do. For much of my adult life, I've struggled with anxiety. So when I find myself particularly bothered or troubled with something, I'll often give her a call on my way to school, considering I have about an hour drive. And that's a lot of time to soak up some good advice. And every single time I talk to her, she always seems to know the right thing to say. And I just feel the anxiety and worry fade away. Lastly, and undoubtedly the most profound and significant reason why I consider my grandmother great is her faith. I could tell dozens of stories that she has shared with me over the years about the incredible experiences she has had through trusting God. But I think the most significant story, and one that I was actually there to witness, was when my grandfather was hit by a drunk driver. 8 years ago, my grandfather was riding his bike on the beach near his home in Florida. The weather was really nice out that day and there weren't that many people around. Well, out of nowhere, a drunk driver pulling a trailer came around the corner and hit my grandfather, and he was run over once by the car and a second time by the trailer. It was 10:30 in the morning. When my grandmother got the call, my aunt told me that she did not hesitate for a second and immediately just said, "Let's go." And off to the hospital everybody went. Fast forward a couple days and my grandfather was put in an induced coma. The doctors came out and told us how when a patient has a hemorrhagic stroke or a brain bleed, 40% of the time it's fatal and 66% of the time they suffer permanent brain damage. Well, my grandfather had 11 places in his brain that were considered hemorrhaging. We were told that he had less than a 1% chance of surviving, and even if he did, he would certainly be in a permanent vegetative state. Well, over the next couple weeks, my grandfather remained in ICU, and every morning at the same time, Dr. Arce, who is the main neurosurgeon in charge, would meet with my grandmother in the morning and give her, as she called it, the litany of bad news. After a couple of weeks of this, my grandmother told me that during one morning, when she was given the news, she just put her hand on Dr. Arce's chest and said, "Dr. Arce, may I ask you something?" A little puzzled he looked, and he responded, "Yes." And then she said to him, "Is it all right with you if I just believe he's going to get better?" He paused for a moment, but then he looked at her and said, "Of course." And that was the last time he ever met with her. Well, the next day, she got to the hospital a little late in the afternoon during one of the visiting times and went to go see my grandfather per usual. As she walked up to the room, she saw Dr. Arce with him, saying with such happiness in his voice, "You're doing so good." This was the first sign of improvement my grandfather had showed the entire time he had been there. Another week passed, and this is the part of the story that I find most incredible. She was sitting outside the room where my grandfather was and said that an unexplainable sensation of warmth just overcame her, and that a sentence out of nowhere appeared in her mind, that sentence being, "If I were going to take him, I would have taken him already." And my grandmother looked up at my uncle, who was standing across the room from her, and smiled, and he mouthed to her, "It's all going to be okay." And she just responded to him, "I know." From that point on, my grandfather continued to shock everybody with his rapid improvement. A few weeks later, my grandmother told me she wrote in her journal, "Today they taught Jimmy, my grandfather, how to walk. And a few weeks after that, how to talk. And a couple weeks after that, how to eat again." Well, fast forward 8 years later, and my grandfather can walk on his own, he can talk, he can feed himself, he cracks jokes, and among other things. He does still struggle with some things, but hey, he's 81 years old, and we were told multiple times that there is no way he would live, let alone regain much of his life back. All that to say, my grandmother during this period, which was so incredibly hard for my family, taught me the power of faith and the strength that it can imbue in a person when hope is all but completely lost. My grandmother is truly a great woman. I could honestly spend hours retelling the stories of her life that she has shared with me to illustrate this further, but for now, I will leave you with this. My grandmother is not great in my eyes because she is accomplished or wealthy or famous or anything like that. My grandmother is great because she taught me the importance of selflessness, patience, and above all else, the power of faith in the face of adversity. Thank you.